As you all know, our job here is effortful, nerve-wracking sometimes, all-absorbing. I can't read a newspaper article without thinking, how does this affect what I ought to be doing in the legislature? And is there some bill that I ought to write that would deal with the problem that's described? And I think that's probably true of many of you. When I came to the House in 2001, it was a very different place than it is now. Several of you have mentioned partisanship. I believe that the House in those days was vastly more partisan than it is now. That may have been the newcomer's perspective, because I think I know more now than I did then, although maybe not very much. But in those days, I had an opinion about everything, usually contrary to the majority at that time, and I wanted to make sure that they heard about it. The motion to close debate occurred frequently. But I got my remonstrance at the end of the session. That finally went away when one day Bob Jensen, talking about the man we've been discussing, said that he was no longer going to support the motion to close debate. And that was the beginning of a big shift in the way in which members of the House treat each other on the floor. I think we are far more politic, far more polite, far more thoughtful in our demeanor, at least, than the House that I served in 2001. And this is not a partisan statement. It's simply a statement of the way in which, members of the House understood their jobs. That was true of Democrats as much as it was of Republicans. So things have changed an enormous amount since then. I will say that Republican speakers didn't know what to do with me. I can honestly say that I've been on every committee that the House has, and a few that it doesn't have anymore, because I kept being moved from one committee to the next. In those days, speakers typically would appoint new committees for the interim. So you'd get two sets of committees during a term, one set during the regular session, and remember we only had one then, and another set during the interim. I always had a complete shift of committees each time. I'll let you figure out why that might have been. I never knew for sure. But I do think that some of the chairs and I didn't get along very well, because I had very strong views about policy, and surprisingly, so did some of them. It was a great privilege to me to serve with some of the members who've been in this House, and I'm only going to mention a couple because I could mention a lot. In 2000, I want to concur with those who've said that 2011 was a great session, because we were evenly divided, and every committee chair had a veto. Every co-chair had a veto over the bills that came before the committee, and what that meant was that the bills on either edge didn't get considered. Only the ones that were sort of in the middle, and the ones where it was clear that some kind of work needed to be done. I had the great privilege of serving with Representative Vicki Berger, mixing the two Vickies up. I have never been good at names. I had the great privilege of serving with Vicki Berger as the co-chair of the Revenue Committee during 2011. And she taught me, both that year and in prior years when she was the Republican vice chair, about what it means to be a good legislator, what it means to compromise and find common ground, and what it means to get the work done. I'd like to add one story about Bob Jensen. Among the many other things that Bob Jensen did, he was the one who got us to the paperless system that we have now. Those of you who have been here a while know that we used to have these giant filing cabinets that took up all the space in the outer office just to hold the files of the bills that we were issued at the session. Stacks of bills on the desk. that you had to find a place for, because you didn't know which ones were going to be heard, and you didn't know which ones were going to eventually end up on the floor. So you had to keep them all, right? Remember that? Bob Jensen figured out a way to use Outlook. Anybody still, I guess everybody here still uses Outlook. Terrible, awful, ghastly email program. But he figured out how to use Outlook as a filing system, and he is the first member of the House that went completely paperless. And he taught us how to do it. And it's taken a long time, but within the last couple of terms, I have almost no paper in my office anymore, and I think that's true of most of the rest of you. So in addition to all the other things that Bob Jensen should be thanked for, that is another one that's important. The quality of the House, in my opinion, continues to improve. Now, again, that may be a perspective of somebody who's had the rough edges knocked off, but I think it's true. The quality of the newcomers in our midst is astoundingly high. I have learned in the last couple of years that I am far less an initiator of legislation and far more a cheerleader to those who are new and have new ideas and are not jaded by having served for a long time. And I find myself saying, yes, that's a great idea, go for it, and tell me how I can help. And I find that's true not just for Democrats, but also for Republicans. Some of my greatest friends and allies and advice givers in the last several sessions have actually been members of the Republican caucus, because they've given me perspective that I might not have had otherwise. And the great pleasure I've had of my vice chairs, including Cliff Bentz and Greg Smith, I greatly appreciate. I have to say I also greatly appreciate the very short time I've known him, Lynn Finley, who there must be something in the water over there, because he and Cliff have very much the same attitude, I think, about how you serve here, and it's one that I find very productive and extremely useful. It's been a very interesting 18 years, 11 years now. I'm in my 12th year as chair of the Revenue Committee, and we've gotten a lot done. Probably my best session was 2009, when we passed the bills that became Measure 66 and 67, and maybe more important than that, the development of the concept that tax expenditures should be evaluated on a regular basis, and the ones that are no longer important should simply go away, that we call the sunset for those things. Although there have been many, many other bills, and I have to say I'm extremely gratified. Please don't consider this a partisan statement, about the fact that we were able to deal this term, this session, with two extremely important tax bills that will help Oregon move forward. I want to say also that when I think about leaving the House, I think about the people I have met in my district. I live in Eugene. I grew up in Eugene. I was the son of a family that worked at the University of Oregon. I had a very isolated and sheltered life, and I was elected in my first term to a district in South Eugene, about 80% Democratic district. It wasn't until my second term, when we did redistricting, that the district that I have now, with a lot of small cities and people who think very differently than I do and have very different needs in many ways, became part of my district. And I learned by going out and talking to people what some of the issues were that those people in the rural parts of my district had. And I think it made me a much better legislator. I understand the infrastructure needs of small cities now. I didn't know anything about that in 2003. I understand some of the challenges of a small city council and mayor and the superintendents of very small school districts like Marcola, and ones that are only slightly larger like South Central Lynn. And I met some fantastic personalities in my district. And I'm not going to go into great detail because I can see people are already looking at the clock, which means that the hook is about there. But I do want to give you a couple of very short little stories. The man who is now mayor of Brownsville, Don Ware, was also the editor of the Times, the Brownsville Times, which they very proudly tell us was founded more than a century ago in Brownsville, and still is about the same size now as it was then. In 2002, we met and we became acquainted. I wouldn't say we were friends, but we certainly knew each other well. And in that primary year, I had only one primary, and that was when 2 state representatives were pushed into the same district in 2002 by redistricting. In that primary, he endorsed my opponent. And he described exactly why, and he made it clear that my opponent is the one who ought to win the Democratic primary. Later, when I saw him, he sort of didn't want to make eye contact, and I went up to him and said, "Don, I really appreciate your editorial." And his response was, "What?" And I said, "You told the truth about the difference between me and my opponent." And of course, Don was known as a very conservative Republican at that time. Still is, I think. And it meant that I won every single precinct in Lynn County in that Democratic primary because he correctly described what our situation was. And I've had great relationships with the mayors and the city councils and the school boards and the school superintendents and others in the rural part of my district, even though most of them probably have never voted for me. We've done very well, and I've learned a lot, and I've been able to carry some of those things forward to here. I want to talk a little bit about the future. I want to concur with comments made by a number of members about the importance of the institution. Sal Esquivel spoke for me on that one. This institution is critically important as an instrument of democracy. And this Republican form of government that we use is crucially important for our future. But when we look out into the future, and I'm talking about not just next week, but years out into the future, and we compare it with where we are today, there are some things that must happen if the Republic is going to survive, and if people are going to live well. And I just want to talk about a couple of those things that, to some extent, you don't have much to say about, but to some extent, maybe you do. A couple of those things. The legislature is going to have to finally come to grips at some point with the problem of funding basic services, which I have been working on the whole time I have been here and have not been successful at getting accomplished. One of the reasons why I am leaving today is because I believe the people in this House who are coming back, who will certainly be reelected, will have a better chance at figuring out how to get there than I have had during the time I've been here. And I look forward to observing and maybe kibitzing a little bit along the way. We have to do our part on the climate change issues, or frankly, other people who do will eat our lunch. They'll eat our economic lunch. They'll eat our future. Some of the huge problems that our country faces, giant problems, that I think we're so embedded in that we don't even notice them most of the time. Or the United States has a less balanced distribution of wealth and income than almost any country in the world right now. 80% of our people have not enough money to replace the next paycheck. 80%, it's an amazing number. A very tiny fraction of the population of the United States own and control most of the assets, a vast majority of the assets. That's got to change. If we have a future as a country, that has to change. And so when you focus on bills, when you focus on every bill, when you focus on a bill, one of the things you have to ask yourself is, what effect will this have on the future of the distribution of wealth in the United States? I believe that when we pay for schools, we give people an education, including poor kids who have nothing, we improve the odds that the distribution of wealth in the United States will improve, because we give them the tools to provide for their families and to do the things they need to do, and you don't get it back next year. You get it back in 20 years. So thinking long-term is critically important. We have to worry about what I call the concept of state capture. It doesn't happen as much in the state as it does at the national level, but we all know that when there's a national regulatory system in place, the most likely outcome is that the industries that are regulated are the ones that are going to control what the actual outcome is of that regulatory system. That is wrong. It has to change. And some of the bills that we've passed this session, like the net neutrality bill, is intended to deal with, in the ways that we can, with those kinds of things. We have to stop the anti-democratic practices that happen around the country. Again, the legislature may not have very much to say about that, but everything we can do to make sure that everyone has a chance to vote, that we continue to have good practices when it comes to redistricting, that we improve our campaign finance law so that people with a lot of money can't control the outcome, and instead we get outcomes that are good for ordinary folks. Look, we have an opportunity, and I'm going to close. We have an opportunity for a great and prosperous and wonderful future if we pay attention to the things that I've mentioned and probably a few more. The future of Oregon can be really bright. If we don't pay attention to these things, it can be really bad. It can be really bad for our children and our grandchildren. So if you're willing to allow me the arrogance to suggest some advice, please pay attention to those few things that I've mentioned today. There are probably a half a dozen that I have forgotten about. And now I think, Madam Speaker, it's time for the motion to close debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative.